Okay, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everybody. Welcome to our first session of the series on the CMC YouTube channel entitled Holding Fast, Principles for Understanding Prophetic Guidance on Fasting. Welcome to everyone joining from all parts of the world. Ahlan wa sahlan, Ramadan Mubarak to all of you. Okay, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma aftah alayna bi rahmatika wa anshur alayna bi hikmatika ya dhal jalali wal ikram. Allahumma allimna min ilmika ma tarda bihi anna wa la tu'akhidna bima ta'lamuhu minna. Allahumma ya halim haqiqna bi khuluq al-hilm wa haqiqna bi haqa'iq al-ilm. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. So welcome again to everybody joining from, mashallah, all parts of the world. Ramadan Mubarak once again. So I'll be your instructor for the series on holding fast. My name is Dr. Mariam Sheibani. I've previously been a visiting lecturer at Cambridge Muslim College, where I taught some workshops. Currently a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Law School and a lecturer at Harvard Divinity School. Very pleased to be with all of you, inshallah, during this blessed month of Ramadan. So the topic that I'll be teaching on and sharing with you about is entitled Holding Fast. And I just wanted to begin actually by sharing with you the idea behind the title of the course. So holding fast, of course, holding the fast of Ramadan, that the fast has this meaning of imsak, of restraint, of holding, but also it's meant also to evoke the meaning of holding fast to the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And as all of you know, and as I'll remind all of us, that when the Prophet Muhammad talks to us about his sunnah and talks to us, meaning, the Muslims that would come after him, he often reminds us to hold fast to the sunnah, right? That, he says, "Taraktu fikum athqalain," that I left with you two, weighty, two mighty things, that in tamassaktum bihima lan tadillu, that if you hold fast to them, that you will not be misguided, that you won't go astray. Kitab Allah, the book of God, wa sunnati, and my sunnah. So that this is what we seek to do all of the time, but in particular in the month of Ramadan. Now, what does that actually mean? This idea of holding fast to the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So oftentimes we have a very kind of simplistic, artificial sense that what it means is that, if someone tells us that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said something, they tell us a hadith, we might ask them, is it authentic? Is the hadith authentic? And if they respond in the affirmative, that it is, then, we are to immediately apply that hadith and put it into practice, that's what it means to hold fast to the sunnah, that you memorize as many hadith as you can, and that if someone, tells you a new hadith, that you apply it, right? So the purpose of this course is actually to give us a bit of a more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of what that means, right? So the basic question that we'll be examining and exploring together is, what is the relationship between individual ahadith as, individual reports or data points? What is the relationship between those individual ahadith and the concept of the sunnah that we are to hold fast onto, right? And how does that sunnah relate to our practice and our everyday lives as Muslims? So this is the basic nexus. You have a hadith, then you have the sunnah, and then you have practice and application. So how do these three concepts or fields of knowledge and information, how do they relate to one another, right? So some of the kind of basic questions or understandings or principles that we'll seek to learn are things like, if a hadith is authentic, right? If it's sahih, what then do we do with that? What does that imply in terms of a scholarly interpretation? What does it imply in terms of our application and our practice, right? And in contrast, if a hadith is deemed to be da'if, if it's weak, Does that mean we know it's weak, it's useless, it's discarded? What does that mean, right? Why would a hadith be deemed weak? And once it is deemed weak, what do we do with that? And this is something that I'm sure many of you have thought about, wondered about, been asked, have received, WhatsApp messages. Often it happens that someone will send a hadith and then someone else will respond saying that hadith is weak, don't share it. It's it has no weight because it's weak, right? And then what do we do if there are ahadith that, two ahadith, for example, that on their face, or if taken literally, right, they seem to us as, the eyes of the untrained non-specialists, they seem to be contradictory, right? The Prophet ﷺ in one hadith did X, and then in the other hadith, he did the opposite of X. So what happens? What do we do with that, right? So these are some of the ideas that we want to explore. Similarly, often we'll hear, why is Imam Malik contradicting this hadith? Hasha, right? Like, why is Imam Abu Hanifa not applying this hadith? This is the hadith, and then we see that Imam Malik's opinion is seemingly in contradiction to that hadith, right? So these are some of these kind of common questions and confusions that we have that we want to start addressing through this course. And we'll do that so we'll learn principles to ground our understanding. And then in as much as possible, the examples that we'll look at will relate directly to fasting into Ramadan. So that's the other kind of area of focus or goal of the course, is to actually, read and reflect upon and understand the interpretations of some of these particular ahadith from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And then finally, it's my hope that this course, this kind of short course, introductory course, will interest some of you in studying further. So what we're learning are principles that you would ordinarily study in, very different Islamic disciplines and in very different scholarly disciplines. Some of them are drawn from the science of usul al-hadith, the sciences of hadith. Some of them are drawn from usul al-fiqh, from theoretical jurisprudence or legal methodology. Some of them pertain to fiqh itself, to substantive law. Some of them pertain to commentary on the ahadith. So I'm drawing on various, disciplines. And my hope is it'll also interest you in learning and studying some of these disciplines to a deeper degree, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So with that introduction then, let's begin with the first lesson and the overview of the first lesson, that today, inshallah, we will look at two questions. And the overview or the outline is given in the form of questions, so that my hope is that once we finish the session, you are yourself able to answer these questions for yourself. So, the first question is, how does hadith relate to the Sunnah? In capitalized big S Sunnah. And the second question is, what are the grades of a hadith's authenticity? Okay, so how does the hadith relate to the Sunnah? And then what are the grades of a hadith's authenticity? So beginning first with this first question of how does hadith relate to the Sunnah? So I'm going to present this in kind of a theoretical, conceptual framework first. And then we will see this over and over again in the examples that we study together. It'll become clearer with time and with more examples. But I first want to introduce it as a framework. So first of all, what is a hadith? So I think, most, if not all Muslims would say a hadith is a statement from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So it's oftentimes a statement, but it could also be a report of the actions or the approval of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So sometimes the Sahabi narrating the hadith will say the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, or he'll say the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did something, or he didn't do something, he simply approved of something. So some of the companions in his presence, for example, they ate a certain food, and although the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't comment on that, nor did he partake in the food, the fact that he approved of it is itself a report and is itself representative of the Sunnah in some respect, right? So it's a statement, a report of his action or of his approval. Now, I should also mention that because it's the hadith and the study of hadith is concerned with the statements and actions and approvals of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's also interested secondarily and by extension in the statements, actions, and approvals of the companions and of the tabi'un, of the successors to the companions. Because oftentimes a hadith will not be something the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, but it's something that one of the companions said. So in the deciphering and in differentiating between the statements of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions, the study of hadith is then interested in the statements and the actions of the companions by extension. So a hadith is comprised of two parts. It's comprised of a report, which in Arabic is the matan, and it's comprised of a chain of transmitters. So any hadith will have these two pieces. So the report is what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said or did, and the chain of transmitters is the listing of the individuals who transmit that report from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So usually when we open a book of hadith, like the compilation of Al-Bukhari, the hadith, the chain of transmitters will begin with Bukhari because he is the one writing this down. So Bukhari will say, I heard from my teacher, who's often a successor, a second generation successor, who heard from a first generation successor, tabi'i, who heard from a companion, who heard from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the chain of transmitters will be reported in the order of reverse order, basically. So reverse historical order based on the individual who's reporting it. They say, this is what I heard. And then the person before will say, this is what I heard, and so on and so forth, until you reach the Prophet Muhammad or the end of the chain of transmitters. So it basically looks something like this that I have here in green. Bukhari reports from his sheikh, from the successor, second successor, companion, and then the report, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said X. So I'm using X now as a shorthand for the matan, the report. Now, the essential thing to understand, the essential point here, is that a hadith is a single anecdote or data point. It's one text, one report, one event that's reported or one statement that's reported. So the hadith is as one individual report or as a handful of reports. It's a historical source. So it's a data point. It's a historical source that we then use to uncover the Sunnah. Okay, so the hadith is a single data point that we use to uncover the Sunnah, which is going to be an aggregate of many data points. Okay, so now let's look at Sunnah, and we'll come back then and compare the hadith versus the Sunnah. So in contrast to the hadith, that's a historical source, right? It's individual reports, anecdotes, right? The Sunnah is the revelatory source that we are told to hold fast to, right? So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ doesn't say, hold fast to one individual thing I said or one thing I did. He's telling us to hold fast to the Sunnah in its aggregate, synthesized form, once it's understood to be representative of what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ taught and embodied. So the Sunnah represents the normative and authoritative precedent of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So some big words here, right? It's representing the Prophet's normative precedent or practice. By normative, we mean not exceptional, right? So normative meaning it's regular, it's representative, it's the practice that he embodied, it's what's, his legacy that he intends for us to embody and to imbibe from him, right? So it's normative, not exceptional, right? And it's authoritative because, again, when the Prophet ﷺ tells us to hold on to the Sunnah, or God tells us, obey the Prophet and follow the Prophet, ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul, right? The intention there is for us not to obey an individual or a particular statement, but to follow the normative and the regular practice of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Sunnah, in contradistinction then to the Hadith, is identified by considering all of the relevant evidence, all of the relevant data points or anecdotes. Data points, let's just use the term data points. So in contrast to a Hadith, this is a Hadith. It's a black one dot, okay? And I'm keeping it black because we still don't know if it's authentic or not. And I'll show you my range of colors in a second. So it's just one data point. The Sunnah is represented by the circle that is encompassing what is normative and what is representative. So in this diagram, which we'll see several times, the green dots, the dark green dots are authentic ahadith, okay? The light green dots are hasan or sound ahadith. The yellow dots are weak ahadith, and the red dots are fabricated ahadith. They're completely false. And then we have these silver or gray dots that are other sources for uncovering the Sunnah. They're not ahadith, they could be ayahs from the Qur'an, there could be principles of interpretation, other things, okay? So what the Sunnah is seeking to uncover, the circle, is what is representative and what is normative from all of these points. So as you'll notice, it includes in it things that are quote unquote weak, and it excludes sometimes things that are authentic, because they're not, for reasons that are, we'll get into later on, they're not representative of the Sunnah, often according to one school of thought. And then of course, there's differences of opinion of where you would draw this circle representing the Sunnah. Okay, so then to summarize what we have here, how does the Hadith then relate to the Sunnah? The body of Hadith, we can say, is the main source for determining the Sunnah. So as you notice in my little diagram here, that most of the dots are colored, most of them are ahadith. It's the main source for determining the Sunnah. When we aggregate all of the relevant ahadith and other things together, that's how we would discover the Sunnah. But what are some of the other sources for the Sunnah, right? What are these gray dots? So briefly, just for us to be thinking beyond just ahadith for the moment, the practice of the early Muslim communities, right? Particularly the community in Medina for the madhab of Imam Malik, and the practice of the people of Kufa for the Hanafis, right? So the idea here is that, in Imam Malik's legal methodology or usul, his argument is that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ lived among the people of Medina. He developed and formed and shaped this community. And therefore, the practices that they continue to practice and the things that they continue to do, 2 or 3 generations after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, is representative of these practices that he himself introduced and encouraged, and that they are, continuing that tradition and that practice, right? So, for example, certain ways of concluding business transactions, or the way in which their determination for weights and measures, or the way in which they would perform the adhan for the prayer, all of these things are seen as representative of the Sunnah, because these are things that, of course, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ introduced, and it has been a continuous, ongoing tradition since the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Another source for the Sunnah is the understandings of the companions. So, and we'll talk about this more, but because the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and in particular a certain subset of the companions, a very small subset of the companions, who were known to be specialists and jurists, they were taught not just what to do, so not just that they say this is what the Prophet ﷺ told me to do, or how he told me to understand a particular verse of the Qur'an, but also that he developed in them a particular acumen or a particular mastery or way of interpreting and resolving new issues and giving fatwa, for example. So the understandings of the companions in general, but in particular certain companions who are seen as, the jurists among the companions. And then thirdly, consensus or ijma' of the scholars of the community, and particularly of the scholars of the community. And this is actually the strongest indicator of what the Sunnah comprises. Because when we have a consensus, it's not, a particular verse of the Quran or a particular hadith or several ahadith even. What a consensus means is that all of the scholars, with all of their different approaches and methodologies and principles for interpretation, all of the scholars looked at all of the verses of the Quran, all of the hadith, all of the, early precedents, And they all agreed that there's only one conclusive conclusion. There's only one decisive conclusion, and they all agreed on that one position to hold, right? And as we know that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ tells us that the community after him will not agree on an error, right? So if the whole community agrees, then that is going to be both theologically and even rationally, it's going to be representative of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And then finally, there's certain principles, usul or qawa'id, that are derived from, again, an aggregate understanding of the Qur'an, of the Hadith, of the early precedent, of the corpus of fiqh, and so on, right? So for example, the principle of, لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى, that nobody will be burdened with the burden of another person. So everybody is only accountable for their own deeds, not for the deeds of their spouse or their friend or their mother or anybody else. So everybody is only responsible for their own deeds. Or the principle, al-yaqeen la yazulu bishak, that certainty, if you have certainty, it's not undermined or removed by doubts that spring forth after you have that certainty. So if you have certainty that you made wudu, for example, and then you doubt, did my wudu, was my wudu vitiated? Did I break my wudu? Well, if you're not sure that you broke your wudu, but you're sure that you had wudu to begin with, then you build on that certainty that you had your wudu, right? And this principle, again, is applied in every area of life. If you have a debt, you owe somebody a debt, then you're not sure, did I pay it back or did I not? Well, you're sure you had a debt, so you build on that certainty, right? So these are other sources that we use and that we look at, in a broad, comprehensive analysis to determine what the Sunnah is. We're going to look at all of these things, right? In addition to the Hadith, okay? So now, a note then on the specialization of the sciences of Hadith and the work of the specialist in Hadith, the Muhaddith, versus the jurist, or the theologian or the ethicist or any other Islamic discipline, right? So the Muhaddith is concerned with one data point at a time, one hadith at a time, right? And the question that they're asking is one question and one question alone: did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say this statement, yes or no? Okay, so the Muhaddith is only interested in, is this truly attributable or ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? They are not interested in whether or not you're going to apply. They're not interested in even the meaning of the hadith necessarily, right? They're not interested in what the hadith is saying, or they're not interested in what we're going to do with that hadith. How are we going to apply it? As a muhaddith, their only concern and task is to determine whether or not the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said this statement. And they look at statement by statement, okay? At some steps and in some stages of their analysis, they might aggregate multiple statements together that are relevant and that echo the same meaning. For example, they'll look at similar hadith to determine, which of them is authentic and whether or not they're saying different things or different nuances. Yes, that is true. But the baseline is that they want to authenticate each hadith text by text, okay? In contrast, the work of the jurist, right, is not, did the Prophet say it or not? That's already done. That job is already done first by the muhaddith. The jurist is then interested in, okay, now that we know the statement was, definitely stated by the Prophet, or almost certainly, or perhaps, or, unlikely, once that analysis has been done, they then are going to look at that hadith within a broader, comprehensive analysis, looking at all of the other relevant data points that have all been individually authenticated as a hadith. They'll bring in the Qur'an, they'll bring in the consensus, the precedent, these principles, the practices of the early community, and then they're going to determine how does that data point relate to all of the others, and most importantly, what is the Sunnah? What is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's normative practice? Sometimes that hadith might be identical with the conclusion of the jurist that something is a Sunnah. Sometimes it might not be, right? So, for example, there are some ahadith, some data points that state that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam would not drink while he was standing, right? So that he's standing up and someone brings him something to drink, for example, he would sit down and then he would consume that drink, right? But then there are other hadith that say that he did drink standing, right? So how do we analyze these various data points? Is it that something used to be allowed and then later on it was no longer allowed? Or did he sometimes drink standing, sometimes drink sitting, in order to show his community that although it's preferable to sit down, that you may also drink while you stand, meaning it's not prohibited, it's only disliked, right? So depending again on how we bring these various data points together, but this whole analysis is the job of the jurist, not the muhaddith. The muhaddith is just going to say the statement that he was drinking while standing is sahih, right? The statement that he was drinking while sitting is hasan or da'if. They're going to give each of these data points a particular rank or evaluation of its authenticity. So this division of labor, right, is echoed and is put into words by Imam al-Shafi'i. The statement is attributed to Imam al-Shafi'i and to other early authorities like Abu Hanifa and others, that is speaking to the hadith scholars, that Imam Shafi'i says, you hadith scholars are the pharmacists and we jurists are the physicians, right? So what does that mean, right? It means that the hadith scholars are authenticating and preparing the medication by medication. Like, see this picture with the pills? They're preparing one pill at a time, right? So one hadith at a time, they're preparing it. But the jurist is the physician who knows how particular ahadith can be used to address particular illnesses, or what combination of ahadith, what combination of medication is to be used to address a particular illness, right? So this is the metaphor that Imam Shafi'i gives us, which is extremely apt, and I think is very illustrative of this division of labor. And in the language then of the modern meme, there's a difference between information, which is the job of the muhaddith, is to determine the authenticity and the legitimacy and the validity of these particular dots, this information, but he's not drawing connections between them, right? Knowledge, which is the fiqh or the fahm of the faqih, he's the one who's going to draw these connections and these lines between these individual pieces of information. So that brings to a close the first half of the presentation, addressing this question of how does the hadith relate to the sunnah, right? So let me now turn to the second half, and then inshallah we'll take some of your questions at the end of the session. So the second question then is what are the grades of a hadith's authenticity? What are the grades of a hadith authenticity? So again, now we're in the realm of the muhaddith. The question then is the job of the muhaddith. This question here of what are the grades of a hadith authenticity, I hope you're following me in understanding that this is the job of the muhaddith, right? Not the job of the jurist. So in answering this question of did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam make a particular statement, right? They're going to answer with one of the following answers, okay? Option one is, did he make the statement? Option one is 100% definitively, certainly he did make the statement, okay? And that is the category of al-mutawatir, or massively transmitted, okay? So something that is massively transmitted is something that at every single level of transmission, starting with the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there are so many people who transmit that hadith that it's rationally impossible that they would conspire to make up the hadith, okay? That there's so many people at each level that it's impossible that they would all get together and conspire and make up this hadith, okay? So for example, like just kind of conceptually, how many of us have been to Malawi? Okay, I'm sure there's like one person who has been, but let's just assume nobody's been to Malawi, and inshallah we'll all go to Malawi, right? But do any of you doubt that Malawi exists? right? Are you all like not sure? Is Malawi really a real country, or is it just a conspiracy? No, right? It's not one particular reason. It's not like, well, I saw a map and Malawi exists on that map, or a friend of mine went to Malawi. It's just so many things, you know. You just know that Malawi exists. There's so many people that are from there. These people are dispersed all over the world. You know, there's no doubt in your mind that Malawi exists. You know, most of us haven't been to like China, for example, right? But we all know China exists, right? And it's not one particular thing. It's just so many different data points and pieces of information that we bring together to conclude that this country exists, right? So now, you know, there's a lot of discussion around how many people have to be, how many transmitters do we need at each level of the hadith, for example. You know, some will say like 10, a minimum of 10, some will say more. But generally speaking, the kind of conclusion is it's not about a particular number. It's about a feeling of certainty and ease that you have, that it's impossible, that, you know, it's just so widely transmitted that it has to be from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. Now, what is mutawatir? Can either be a particular hadith, like a particular statement, or it can be a meaning, a generalized meaning. So for example, first of all, I should mention that there's a very few ahadith that are mutawatir. It's really a handful, right? It's a drop in the bucket of the ocean of hadith, because of these very rigorous standards for what constitutes mutawatir. It's very rare that a hadith meets these conditions, right? But subhanAllah, one of the ahadith that's kind of the paradigm case for the mutawatir hadith, this massive transmission, is this hadith that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Man kadaba alayya muta'ammidan falyatabawwa maq'adahu min an-nar." That whoever lies about me intentionally, let him prepare a seat for himself in the fire. Now, subhanAllah, you think, why is this hadith mutawatir? Because the companions and then the generations after them took this so seriously, this transmission of hadith, that this was something that, you know, they transmitted this, right? Like, if you're going to be involved in this business of transmitting hadith, then make sure that you're doing it faithfully and accurately, right? Don't lie about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Don't say he said something when he didn't actually say it, because this is, you know, you're paving your path to the fire. So this is one of these ahadith, very few ahadith, that is massively transmitted. It's also possible, however, that a particular meaning or a teaching is mutawatir, even though the individual ahadith that, you know, constitute this meaning are themselves not mutawatir. What I mean by that is, for example, that we have the meaning, the mutawatir meaning, that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he made dua, that he would raise his hands in supplication, right? And although none of the individual ahadith that mention him raising his hands, none of them by themselves are raised to this level of mutawatir, of certainty. Together, right, at different events, different moments in his life that he raised his hand in dua, if you bring all of them, you pool all of them together, it gives you this meaning. They're like overlapping circles, right? There's a concentric circle that in the middle, he always raised his hands, right? In a particular event, or another time someone comes to him and asks him to pray for him and he raises his hands, and so on. So this is a mutawatir meaning of raising the hands in dua being part of the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so the first option is something is mutawatir, meaning it's 100% certain the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam made a statement. If it's not in the category of mutawatir, it's in kind of a catch-all category of ahad or solitary, which doesn't mean it's one report, one transmitter, or one report. It just means it's not massively transmitted. Okay, so what's not massively transmitted, okay, the likelihood that it's truly transmitted and stated by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam can be from 1% possibility to 99% possibility, right? So it's possible that 1% that he said it, or 99% we're almost certain he said it, but it doesn't quite meet the requirements of the mutawatir. Now, within this category then of ahad, okay, we have the familiar categories of sahih, authentic, and hasan, sound, and da'if, which we'll get to in a minute. And I should also note that these percentages of, 99 to 90% sahih is the likelihood it's transmitted from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or validly ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These percentages that I have here are not, it's not an exact science, right? The science of hadith is actually not a science, it's a craft, right? It's an art. So I'm sharing these percentages to give us a sense, to give us a kind of, again, conceptual idea of what we're talking about here. They were shared, you won't find these in books of hadith. This is something that one of my teachers shared with me that I found useful, and so I share it with you. But it's a general ballpark figure, right? So Sahih is somewhere above 90%, right? It's very, very, very likely that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ made a particular statement. Okay. An example of a Sahih hadith is عن أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم تسحروا فإن في السحور بركة. Okay, so Anas radiallahu anhu reports that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, have suhoor, for in the suhoor there is blessing, there is barakah, right? So inshallah, this is, a very practical hadith for us to apply. I'm sure many of us are already doing that, but even if you're not inclined to have suhoor because you don't feel like you need it, it's still a sunnah, and in it is barakah, right? At many levels, some you might know, meaning you might feel the day goes by faster and the fast is easier, you feel that barakah, or there could be other types of blessings that we don't even perceive or feel or experience, but that there is blessing in that. And this particular hadith is muttafaqun alayh, meaning it's agreed upon by the two soundest collectors of hadith of Bukhari and Muslim. So this is the highest degree of sahih, because there's also various degrees of sahih, right? There's 6 authentic books of hadith, Sihah al-Sit. Bukhari and Muslim are at the highest level of what is authentic because of the conditions that they placed for a hadith to be included in this category of authentic and to be included in their collection, right? So this hadith is, as authentic as it gets, right? Now, if it's not, okay, sorry, one more thing now. Now, the hadith says, have suhoor, for in suhoor there is blessing. It is a sahih hadith. It's not mutawatir. However, there are so many ahadith that insist on having suhoor, right? So not just this one hadith that I said is really, really sahih, but there's many other ahadith, right, that insist on this meaning of the suhoor being, blessed, and insistence and encouragement to have suhoor, okay? And there's also many, many ahadith that insist on rushing to break the fast, right? So don't, that doesn't mean as soon as you hear the adhan, you have to eat immediately. It actually is a good idea to keep a minute or two, given the fact that we are using, calculation and apps and so on, but that you don't wait an hour or two or longer or continue your fast to do this wisal of continuing the fast into the next day. But no, you break your fast, right? Soon after you hear the adhan, right? Now, although the ahadith concerning insistence on having suhoor and rushing to break the fast, individually, they are sahih or less than sahih, together, right, when you look at all of them together, they're so prolific, they're so massively transmitted that the meaning is itself mutawatir. Okay, so I hope that makes sense based on what we said about mutawatir earlier. Okay, so we have the possibility of 100% certainty, mutawatir. Okay, we have the possibility of sahih, authentic, 90% or higher. And then we have a category of hasan, okay, fair. So between 80 and 90% probability. And as we'll see next week, inshallah next week, we'll look at the conditions for each of these categories. We'll see that the hasan is almost sahih, right? It's just right below the sahih. And the sahih meets 5 conditions, and the hasan is meeting 4 conditions, but it's weak in the 5th condition, basically. Okay? So the hasan is it's fairly probative, right? It's fairly likely the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it, but formally it doesn't fully meet one of the 5 conditions. Okay? So an example of a hasan hadith is this hadith in which the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, التسبيح نصف الميزان والحمد لله يملأه والتكبير يملأ ما بين السماء والأرض والصوم نصف الصبر والطهور نصف الإيمان. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, as is reported in Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah, in Hasan hadith, that Subhanallah, the recitation and repetition of Subhanallah, fills the scale. Alhamdulillah, sorry, my bad. Subhanallah fills half of the scale. And Alhamdulillah fills it completely. And Allahu Akbar fills what is between the heavens and the earth. So these are the things that we repeat after every prayer. Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, 33 times each, right? So, the next time we pray, let's come to that dhikr with this, with this image in mind, that Subhanallah fills half the scale, Alhamdulillah fills it completely, and Allahu Akbar fills what is between the heavens and the earth. And then the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ continues to say, fasting is half of patience, and purification is half of faith, right? So the main thing here is that fasting is half of patience, right? And in another hadith, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says, "As-sabru nisful iman," that patience is half of belief, of iman. So that makes fasting half of patience, and it makes fasting a quarter of iman, right? So this is the weight given to fasting and to patience within, our broader belief in God and practice. And as we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about patience in particular, إِنَّمَا يُوَفَّى الصَّابِرُونَ أَجْرَهُمْ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ, that the patient will be recompensed their reward without accounting, without measure, right? So, Imam Ghazali, he makes this connection between this ayah and this hadith, saying, therefore, fasting, the reward for fasting is without measure, because God says that he rewards patience without measure, and fasting is half of patience, right? And it's also echoed by other hadith where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِلَّا الصِّيَامَ فَإِنَّهُ لِي وَأَنَا أَجْزِي بِهِ, that all acts of the son of Adam are for him, except for fasting, that it's for me, and I reward it, right? So it's beyond the reward of fasting is beyond any measure. And finally, the hadith says, and purification is half of faith, right? Purification, of course, is not just the outward purification, but most importantly also the inward purification of the self and of the heart. So we've talked about Sahih and Hasan, and now the third and final possibility for a solitary hadith is that it's da'if or weak. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the da'if hadith, I'm saying here in my division, is that its probability is from 1%, very low, to 80%, right? And I think that's probably surprising to many of you, because when we think of da'if, we think it's, less than 50% chance that he said it. It's weak, it's less probable than it is probable. It's, 49% or less, right? But in fact, the da'if hadith is there's many reasons why a hadith might be da'if. Like when you study the science of hadith, you'll spend, like, let's say 10 pages on Sahih, 3 pages on Hasan, because it's kind of an extension of Sahih. And the rest of the book, let's say another 50 pages, if not more, 70 pages perhaps, is about the da'if hadith, right? And there's grades within da'if of, lightly weak, or, weak, or very, very weak, right? So we're going to come back to this issue of the weak hadith. And I'd like us to think about, well, how can a weak hadith be 80% likely that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said it? What does that look like, and why, right? So I'm going to leave this here as an open question of what does that mean? And then we'll look at it in terms of how can it be so likely that he said it and still be weak? And then what do we then do with weak hadith? How do we apply them and when? So we'll have that whole discussion, inshallah. We'll put pause on that, and we'll pick up with that next week as well. So an example of a weak hadith is this hadith that nawmu as-sa'imi ibadah, that the sleep of the fasting person is an act of worship. So this hadith, this statement, right? The question of, did the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ say this? He likely did not say this. It's a weak hadith, okay? However, the fact that he didn't say it, right, does not mean that it's untrue. It does not mean that its meaning is not true or useful or something that we should be thinking about, right? So this particular hadith, the sleep of the fasting person is a ibadah. This is a meaning that's something that is understood and believed by Muslims in general, and that scholars will tell you, especially if that sleep is done in a spirit of, strengthening the person for ibadah, or, strengthening the person in their fast to be able to then be productive in the rest of the fast, that the sleeping of we know this from other ahadith and other principles, that the meaning is correct. However, the hadith itself is weak, right? So again, let's come back to what we do with weak hadith next week, but just because I'm saying it's weak doesn't mean its meaning is incorrect or that it's useless, right? And then finally, okay, if a hadith is fabricated, meaning somebody literally made it up and said, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said Y, okay? I mean the letter Y, right? So that means there's 0% chance the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that statement because somebody made it up, right? So this is the mawdu' or fabricated hadith. An example of that is this hadith, it's not a hadith, the statement that i'tikafu 10 fi Ramadan kahajjatayn wa umratayn. That i'tikaf for 10 days in Ramadan is equivalent in reward to performing 2 hajj and 2 umrahs, right? So why would somebody make up this hadith, right? I mean, why does this text exist? Why does this statement exist? So what happened is, in the early period of Islam, some people with good intentions made up a hadith, and their explanation for why they made up these hadith was that we're not lying against the Prophet, we're lying for the Prophet, right? So in the hadith I mentioned earlier, the mutawatir hadith, that the one who lies about me intentionally, let him take his place in the fire. The wording in Arabic is man kadhaba alayya, the one who lies against me, right? Or lies about me. So they're saying we're not lying against the Prophet, we're lying for the Prophet, lahu, not alayhi, right? So they're saying that, he encouraged the i'tikaf, right? People need to be incentivized more than just the encouragement of the i'tikaf. So they made up a hadith about all sorts of beautiful acts of worship. And this mawdu' hadith is very subdued. You'll notice often mawdu' hadiths are extremely, sorry to say, it's like really bad that they made them up, but they're actually extremely entertaining to read because they'll often go into like excruciating details that none of the actual ahadith go into. So about Ramadan, there's these ahadith that, when Ramadan comes, the first night of Ramadan, there's a special breeze under the arsh of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the Hur al-Ain, they begin to ask God, choose for us from among those who are fasting spouses to be with us. And then these spouses, they get 70,000 cloaks of different types, each 70,000 cloaks in the paradise. And each of the cloaks has a different fabric, and they have 70,000 plates of food, and each of the plates of food has a different taste, unlike any of the other 70,000 plates. So it's this level of detail of rewards of paradise and all sorts of numbers and details and explanations that you don't ordinarily hear in the ahadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's kind of a red flag that something might be a little bit fishy, and that someone is trying to incentivize people to do things by making up a hadith, quote unquote, for the sake of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which of course is something prohibited and also not necessary. Anything that we need, we've been left with, and we don't need to help the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so to speak, to explain and elucidate his teachings. So that brings our session to a close. So today we looked at two things, two principles, so to speak: how the hadith relates to the Sunnah, and then what are the grades of a hadith's authenticity. And just a quick kind of summary, that a hadith is a single anecdote, whereas the Sunnah represents the normative precedent of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that according to definitiveness, we divide a hadith into categories of mutawatir, 100% definitive, certain, and then probabilistic ahad, less than 100%, so 99% or less. And the ahad is further categorized by authenticity into sahih, hasan, da'if, and mawdu'. Authentic, sound, weak, and fabricated. And then finally, that the authenticity of a hadith, right, whether it's in one of these categories, does not necessarily tell us how it is applied, and that there's a division of labor between authentication of hadith, the work of the Muhaddith, and the work of the jurist, who determines how we then apply that hadith. And we'll see a little bit more about the work of the jurist, inshallah, in the coming weeks. So we have this diagram I'd like you to recall, and this division of the percentages. And then next week, inshallah, we will look at the following questions. How is a hadith authenticated? So how does a hadith land in one of these categories, right? And then once we determine that, we now have authentic hadith and weak hadith. Are authentic ahadith always applied? And are they always applied literally? And secondly, are weak ahadith always discarded? Okay, so these are the questions, inshallah, that we will look at next week. And for the slides, inshallah, I will be putting them up on my website, and inshallah, the CMC team will put a link to that link. But I'll be putting them up after the class, inshallah. So within the hour, hopefully sooner, I'll post the slides, and I'll do that as a regular sunnah, as a regular practice, normative practice, that we'll put the slides up, inshallah, after the course is over. So I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. So let me just take a look now at the questions that we have. Okay. All right. So let me take a couple of these questions. They're all very good. So I'm going to take them in just a logical order for my for the content of the question. So one question is asking, in the tradition, weren't the muhaddithun also fuqaha? Were there specializations like nowadays? So that's a great question. So how many Sahaba did we have? How many Sahaba, not did we have, but how many Sahaba existed, right? So we have estimates of approximately 114,000 to, I'm going to use the whiteboard here if that's okay. So how many Sahabas existed? The estimates by people like As-Suyuti, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, they say something between 114 and 124,000 Sahaba. Okay. And how many of them narrated hadith? Again, the estimate is 1,000 companions transmitted hadith. So only 1,000 of the 120 or so thousand reported and transmitted things that they heard or saw from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I think that would be something like 0.001%, right? Something like that. Now, how many companions were jurists, right? How many of the companions specialized in jurisprudence, meaning how many companions gave fatwa on at least one occasion? Okay, 130. Only 130 gave fatwa at least on one occasion. I think you can still see my whiteboard. Okay. Now, how many of those companions gave fatwa, gave more than 10 fatwas? Or actually, let me put it this way. Let's put it this way. So how many of these companions, right, gave fatwa that if you collect all of their fatwa, okay, in a book, if you collect all of their fatwa in a book, then you would have, okay, a small volume of collection, a small collected volume, okay? Only 13 that their fatwas are a small compilation, okay? And of these 130, only 100 gave fatwa on 1 or 2 occasions. So we really only have 13 muftis, serious muftis, from among the companions, because the ones who are giving fatwa on 1 or 2 occasions, right? Sometimes they're not actually giving the fatwa. They're just saying that I had a particular case that happened to me and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gave me this fatwa, right? And then of these 13, okay, we only have 7 that are really considered to be the main specialists in law and fiqh among the companions. And these are the 7 companions that if you collected all of their fatwas, that you would have a large compilation. Okay, and who falls in this category, right? Aisha, Umar, Ali, Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. How many do I have here? And Zayd ibn Thabit. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, and Zayd ibn Thabit. So to answer your question then about specialization, right? From the very beginning of Islam, it was recognized that, there are different specializations, and some companions, for example, like Abu Huraira, he was not among, these 7 or these 13, right? That he was not among those who excelled in fiqh. He was a collector of hadith. He was like the quintessential muhaddith, that he collected a hadith, and he was the most prolific among the Sahaba in transmitting hadith, right? But other companions didn't transmit as much hadith, but they were known to give fatwa, right? So, I'm sorry, I forgot Abdullah ibn Abbas, very important. So, and in this discussion here, you can find in Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Hazm before him that they compile the fuqaha among the companions, right? Very interesting for us to think about scope. So, since the very beginning, there is an understanding of specialization, and even among these seven, some of the companions specialize in particular disciplines. Like Aisha, she was a faqihah, one of the top fuqaha among the companions, but even she, they say, she had particular specializations like in inheritance and in particular areas of law that she was particularly specialized in, right? And then even among the early generations, you see, some division between the muhaddithun and the fuqaha, but you have exceptional cases of people like, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Imam Ahmad, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, who are both muhaddithun, par excellence, as well as fuqaha. Right, so there are people who did master both, but after the early period, that's extremely rare, right? So you have people who are primarily, jurists or primarily muhaddithun, and it's very rare that someone would be a master of both, right? It's possible, but it's because of the depths of each of these disciplines that people really focus and specialize in one or the other. So another question then is, have there been studies comparing the hadith methodology with the Western historical method? I think a really good study on this is Jonathan Brown's book on hadith. I can't remember the exact title, but it's entitled Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Modern World or something like that. He has a good chapter in there comparing methodologically the Western approach to the study of hadith and the traditional Muslim approach. And just from a kind of someone who studied both, I can tell you that there's been a very clear kind of like rapprochement, like the two narratives have increasingly kind of converged, that more recent hadith studies in the Western Academy are increasingly in agreement with the traditional Muslim narrative, obviously with different emphases, to different extents. But generally speaking, the very kind of skeptical early Orientalist study of hadith of people like, Shaft and Goldziher and others you might know of, that paradigm and that narrative about the construction of hadith has largely been debunked in favor of, much closer analysis of, the early Orientalists only had certain sources at their disposal, and they had particular methodological assumptions that they made. And once you introduce other assumptions that are more reasonable even, and you look at a greater array of sources and you look at them more deeply, then you come up with a very different conclusion. So just as a kind of general a statement here,